that walking into a hospital sometimes makes me sick. So this week I stopped by the hospital to visit somebody, and now I'm sick. I don't know if there's a correlation between those two, but we will make it through. So thanks for being here. And Cindy and girls, young women, thank you for being here too. And it's fun to just see. I mean, again, some of these weeks, the past 3 weeks, we've had missionaries from Papua New Guinea. Last week we had the Ajuberos here from Nigeria. And then this morning, Hope Harbor. And it just worked that way. Some of those were planned, some of them were not. But it's so important for us to be reminded. So there's a great pattern in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. And Jesus says, you're going to be my disciples in Jerusalem and Judea, and to Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And it's just a great pattern for us. Because there's a lot of churches that focus just locally, only focus on what's happening in their own backyard and across the street, to the detriment of what's happening globally. And then vice versa, you have churches that they send 40 trips a year to Nigeria and Papua New Guinea and Germany, and those are vital, but many times at the expense of what's happening across the street. And so it's been fun to see and intentional for us to hold up before you ways for us as a church to be involved globally. It's not a word I made up. It's not a frog in my throat. It's the combination of global and local. And so for us as a people, as a church, to be involved with what's happening in our own backyard, and then seeing God moving and stirring for the nations, and hearing what's going on, and how we can be involved in Papua New Guinea and Nigeria and every spot in between. And so thank you, and it's fun to hear those stories, and for us as a church to be involved. So last week we did see in chapter 3, verses 1 to 12, this kind of focus on the tongue. And James, in many ways, kind of zoomed in for us just on this one aspect of our life. And the Bible will tend to do that. We'll zoom in, kind of a microscopic zoom into our heart, to our soul, to our inner person. You think of Proverbs 4, for the heart is the wellspring of life. And then there's other times that it will zoom way out, and you need a telescope to see. You know, the heavens declare the glories of God. And so this morning's text goes from kind of this microscopic zoom in on our tongue to about a 30,000-foot flyover of our lives. And so we'll kind of see what James is doing here. Kind of the long view for us, the progression of the choices that we make, the options before us, that many times we choose one at the detriment of the other. We choose one and not sure what the outcome of the other would be. One of the things our kids are into right now is the Choose Your Own Adventure books. Remember those? I used to love those growing up. Right, you're kind of reading, and you're standing at this path at the edge of the woods, right? And so if you want to go into the woods, turn to page 78. Then you turn to page 78 and you meet a bear who mauls you, and you're like, nah, never mind. Hey, let's go back. So you're standing, you're on this path at the edge of the woods. I'm not going to the woods. I don't want to get mauled again. So let's take the path, and it leads you down into this valley, and you find this hidden treasure, and the story ends, right? And we get that option with those books. To go, I don't like that. That was a bad decision. I know where it ends. I don't want to get mauled by a bear. I'd rather have the treasure. So we back up a little bit and navigate the way that we want to go. So this text, I think, holds up for us a very similar aspect with life in view. Again, 30,000-foot flyover of this is where we are. And here's two pathways that are before us that are ever widening, the gap between them grows further and further away as we near the end of this morning's text. In Deuteronomy 30, God's communicating to the people, and he says in Deuteronomy chapter 30, I've set before you life and death. Choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days. So again, I've set before you life and death. Choose life. Right? Don't get mauled by a bear when you can have all of these great things. And so again, this contrast for James, there's three different sections, and this amazing contrast between these two options in this morning's text. But what I want you to see from these verses, 3:13 to 4:3, is that life lived according to God's wisdom will always produce a beautiful bounty of righteousness. Always. But the flip side of that is that when we live our lives for ourselves, with our own satisfaction, our own passions, our own goals in mind, it will always end in a catastrophic storm of wreckage. Always. So, let's look at the first contrast, verses 13 and 14. Again, the contrast here is between gentle and aggressive, but really looking at the call to a life of wisdom. That's the call that James is holding up before us. As he looks at both of these, the call for us ultimately is for us to see the beauty of this call toward wisdom. So, looking at how the fruit in our life is displayed. Again, that's kind of the recurring theme throughout James, is what is the fruit in our life pointing us toward? What is the fruit in our life demonstrating about our faith? So verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. So here, this call of show his works. You show your works. That's a command for us. Again, we don't get the option of sidestepping. It's not a suggestion. Hey, if you get around to it, it'd be good for you if you did this. No, he's saying this is a call for you. Display the works in your life with meekness, with wisdom. Again, he's implying here that there's good conduct for us. So we tend to hear meekness, this meekness of wisdom, as weakness. And in many contexts in today's culture, those two are equated. So to be meek doesn't mean to be gentle, it means to be weak. And I want to point you to the reality this morning that biblically speaking, meekness is restrained power. Restrained power. So I have the authority to do what I want. I have the ability and the authority and the strength and the vitality to do what I want. And yet in gentleness, I restrain myself. Right? So Jesus uses this word, Matthew 11, verses 28 and 29. If any of you is laboring and heavy laden, you're desiring rest for your soul, let him come to me. Let him come to me and take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, because I'm gentle in spirit. I'm gentle. This word gentle here is meek. So Jesus takes the idea, the cultural idea of weakness and recategorizes it in terms of, again, this restrained power, this restrained authority of meekness and gentleness. Right? Al Capone, famous gangster from about a century ago from Chicago, said, don't mistake my kindness for weakness. I'm kind to everyone, but when someone's unkind to me, weak isn't what you're going to remember about me. Said from one of the most notorious gangsters in American history. So the call here is to let your good works be naturally evidenced in your life. So meekness for us. That didn't work. Thought if I flip to mute, cough, flip it back on, we're good. Apparently not. Fantastic. So the call here is to simply let the works in your life make their way out gently, in meek ways. Meekness displays a deep and abiding confidence in all that God has provided, all that God has done for you, all that God promises to do for you, all these long-term end goal promises that we have throughout Scripture for us. Meekness simply rests in those. It's not I'm going to vie for my own authority, vie for my own position. I'm going to self-promote and all of these things that he's contrasting against, which we'll look at in a minute. It's not those things. It's just a gentle resting in all that God has done. right? So pull back. Again, we're at about 30,000 feet. So for you today or sometime this week to pull back on your life, right? From a 30,000 foot flyover and look at the ways that God has provided. Look at the ways that God has worked in you. Right? Look at the promises throughout Scripture that are for you as a child of God. Right? That will naturally diffuse aggressiveness. It will naturally diffuse kind of propping ourselves up. It will bring about meekness. Just simply reflecting on the gospel that God has worked in us and for us. And then again, there's this massive contrast in verse 14. But, so display these works in good conduct with meekness, the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. So again, embedded in these terms of jealousy and selfish ambition is kind of this idea of animosity and resentment toward God, toward the promises that He's made for His people. And so the result of that is not a gentleness and a meekness, but almost this heart that wants to loudly display. That's the contrast here, this displaying, this showing of works in meekness and wisdom, and this boasting that's false to the truth. And so it's rooted, again, not in a heart that understands and rests in all that God has done, but kind of this self-promoting, selfish ambition, vain conceit. So looking at what somebody else has, the pattern of their life and just their overall experience and wanting to embed yourself in that and wanting those very same things for ourselves. And so it's not a deep and abiding trust in all that God has done and all that God is doing and all that God promises to do. But if they've got it, that's what I want. So I'm going to do what it takes to do the very same things, to earn the very same things, to live my life so that I get the very same things. And there's this boasting that's false to the truth. So again, here is another command. Don't boast. So James is holding up for us and saying that the call for us is toward godly, gentle, meek wisdom, not in a boasting that's false to everything that God has deemed true and false. So again, it has a low view of God's goodness, has a low view of God's authority, has a low view of God's sovereignty and control, right? Because if you don't believe that God has your end in mind and the best for you in mind, then you will do everything in your power to circumvent and provide for yourself. Because God doesn't really know what I need and what I want and what's best for me. So I'll make every effort and every attempt to just do those things and produce those things on my own. So it's false to the truth. It's a devaluing of all that God has done. It's all a devaluing of all that God not just provides for us, but all the ways that He works in us and through us and for us in the gospel. It's kind of this mantra of I'll just do it myself. God, just get out of my way. I know what's best, and I know what I need to do in order to get those things, so I'll just do it myself. What about you? Again, to reel back, hit that 30,000 foot mark in your life and just evaluate. Is your life marked by a deep and abiding confidence in God's mercy, in God's grace? Not just in what God has done, right, but all that God promises to do and bring about. Right? The beauty here is that the work has been done for us. Again, so going back to what I said a minute ago, this idea of meekness. In Matthew 11, the idea there, I remember years ago we were at a student retreat, and Jesus' words there, take my yoke upon you. And I remember afterwards this girl came up to me. She was a pastor's kid. There's hope for us. But she comes up to me and says, I don't understand this verse. Why would Jesus say, take my yoke upon you? And she had in her mind this idea of egg. crack it open, have Jesus pour his yoke on you. Like, yeah, I don't get this. It just sounds nasty. And so from that point on, I had a poster that I kind of hung up in our youth room of a yoke, that oxen are tied together with, and a yoke from an egg. Jesus isn't asking us to pour his yoke upon us. He's asking us, as the weaker party, to lock ourselves, to tie ourselves to him. The work has been done for us. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle in spirit. Right? So this idea of we're just along for the ride in so many ways in the Christian life. This isn't a get to work. It's not a call to produce and demonstrate our worth. It's a call to rest over and over and over. It's a call here, even in this, a resting in all that God has done. The second thing that we see in verses 15 and 16 is, again, this massive contrast between heavenly and demonic motivations. So point 2, the credit for a life of wisdom. So we saw a call to a life of wisdom, now the credit for a life of wisdom. So in the first half of verse 15, this is not the wisdom that comes down from above. So you'll remember that we've seen this language used already in James chapter 1. And this points us to the reality that, again, this is external to us. Right? It's wisdom that comes down from above. In other words, it's not wisdom that we produce ourselves. It's not a godly life that we produce ourselves. It's not salvation that we produce ourselves. It's external to us. And it's, just a very vivid reminder of the gospel for us. Most of what you see in our context, in our culture today, is this idea of the problem is outside of us and the solution is inside of us. Right? So go home and go to Amazon, go to Google, go to the Christian bookstore, and look at self-help books. Like the market is flooded with self-help books. Right? That's what sells. You want to write, you want to sell 1 million copies of a book? Write on this theme. It's self-help. The problem is outside of us. So the solution is just eat non-GMO foods, right? Only eat clean vegetables, right? Only drink coffee that's from fair trade countries, right? Do enough yoga and enough introspection, right? Just meditate enough, right? Lock your kids in the basement from the big bad world. Like, this is the idea that we see so often. The problem is out there. The solution is in here. I don't know if you watch any movies by M. Night Shyamalan. Maybe you don't even know how to pronounce that. Right? He's released a number of movies over the past 15 years. And early on, they were thought to be horror movies. And then you realize they're not horror movies as much as they are just thriller movies. Like, there's a massive twist that occurs that you go, wait a minute. What just happened? One of those from about 2004 is called The Village. And I'm going to spoil it for you, but here's the thing. If you've not watched it since 2004, that's on you. So the idea is this group of people gets together and sees the destruction that's happening in culture. Right? Hell, culture's going to hell in a handbag. Let's separate ourselves. So these families gather together, find a plot of land in the middle of nowhere, and create a village. But in order then to keep the next generation there, they create this idea of this demonic presence that's out and about in the woods. So if you go out in the woods, it's going to get you. And really, it's just somebody from the village dressed up in a red costume. Right? So the idea there is, and in the end, what happens is somebody in town gets murdered. Somebody in this village gets murdered. And it got horrible reviews, but I think it's a fantastic picture for us of this very idea. Right? The problem is out there. So we'll isolate ourselves, we'll separate, we'll live in the woods by ourselves. It doesn't fix the problem. Murder happens right in the village, and it's the same thing for us. The problem isn't out there with the solution being inside of us. What the Bible points us to over and over and over is that the problem is in here. And the only solution for us comes from outside of us. That's the very heart of the gospel. Our hearts, Jeremiah 17:9, our hearts are desperately sick. Who can understand them? And God says, I can. And from the outside, I'm going to send my son to live the life that we were called to live, die the death that we were called to die. And by faith in him, we are credited with his perfect record. That's what comes from outside. So it's not just go read some self-help books and everything's going to be great. No, it's not. Because it's just trying to fix what we can't fix. It was never designed that way. So back to chapter 1. So this wisdom comes down from above. Chapter 1, verse 5. If anybody lacks wisdom, let him ask from God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. And then verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. So James is saying here in verse 15, the first half of verse 15, it's not the wisdom that comes down from above. There's another place that word is used, actually twice, in John chapter 3. You remember John 3? Famously, verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. But the context of that is Nicodemus. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night as a Pharisee, doesn't want to be seen. And there's this conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus about eternal life, about new birth. And Jesus says to Nicodemus, wait a minute, you're the teacher of Israel, and you don't get this, right? He's kind of talking about in John 3, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. The connection there is the word again. The word is the same as from above. So in John 3, what Jesus is telling Nicodemus is unless you're born from above, you cannot see the kingdom of God. It's the same language here that again, James, the half-brother of Jesus, knows that word. He expects his readers to catch that word, right? He's saying, this is not the wisdom that comes down from above. This is the gift of God. The same as salvation, the same as eternal life that comes down by the new birth. This is the same call for us. This is a heavenly gift that's been given to us. Right here is a picture for us of death to life. Paul writes in Galatians 2:20, I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. That's all bound up in this word from above. Not just, hey, you want to be smart, ask God for wisdom, he's going to give it to you. And then you'll live a successful life. No, this is tied to eternal life. Right? So having all the wisdom in the world apart from eternal life means nothing. No, eternal life comes first. And as a believer, as a child of God, to be granted new life and then to be given a new heart and a new mind to live for God according to the wisdom that he gives us. That's all the picture here. So the credit for a life of wisdom ultimately is heaven itself. It's God himself. And then again, we see this contrast. So in the middle of verse 15, it's earthly. So it's not this kind of wisdom, but it's earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. Notice the progression again from bad to worse in a life lived untethered from God. So he's kind of pointing to these things. It's not just jealousy and selfish ambition, but it's earthly, it's unspiritual, it's demonic. Right, so this is picking up on the theme that we saw, or we've seen really throughout James. It listens to the wisdom of the world, as we saw in the end of James chapter 1. So it listens to, and then it begins to adopt the wisdom of the world. We saw last week that the tongue is set on fire by hell itself. The same thing here. It just progresses to the point that he's saying that when we live outside of or contrary to the wisdom that God gives, it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So it's under the wisdom of the world, which is ultimately under the control and authority of Satan. himself. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4, it's the God of the world. It's the God of this world that's blinded their minds, or blinded the minds of the unbelievers, to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel. So it's amazing how often throughout the New Testament we see these images, these descriptions for Satan himself. He's the prince of the power of the air. Right? Jesus, at one point, is kind of going after the Pharisees. And Jesus tends to do that. He usually goes after the rich and the religious because they say, look, I've got this figured out. I can do this on my own. I don't need you. I can buy all the things that I need, or I can just perform well enough to earn my way to God. We don't need you. And at one point, Jesus goes after them, and there's this discussion about who's our father. You know, and Jesus is saying, you know, Father Abraham and these kinds of things. He doesn't sing the song to them, but kind of points to them and says, your father has been killing from the beginning. Your father is Satan himself. Now, I'm not sure that earned him many brownie points with the Pharisees, who would eventually be the ones that kind of pointed him to his death. To look at them and say, you are not God's children. You are not the offspring of Abraham, and all of your religious duties, they mean nothing because ultimately your father is Satan himself. And this wisdom that follows that very same trajectory and that very same pattern is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. It brings disorder, it brings chaos, it brings instability and insecurity. And the language here, you know, of jealousy and selfish ambition, it really is just this vile and despicable behaviors. So again, now we see this gap between these two that James is contrasting starting to widen ever more. And he's saying that these people, there's a tendency to turn toward three of the very things that Jesus came to defeat: the world, the flesh, and the devil. I remember, I think I was 13 or 14 when we were living in Berlin. We had the opportunity to go on a field trip. We went to a concentration camp about an hour outside of Berlin. And I don't know that a 13 or 14-year-old can adequately grasp everything that a concentration camp meant or still means today. But it's amazing to me how often in the Bible there's this picture of absolute freedom in Christ. And yet the people want to return to slavery. People want to return to the very thing that God has set them free from. So God has said, I've set you free from the world. I've set you free from flesh and the devil and sin itself. And how often you turn back to the very same thing that I've opened the gates for you from. And you think of a place like a concentration camp and flinging the gates open wide and saying, you're free. Go live your life in this new freedom. And saying, nah, you know what? I actually like my bunk. I'll just hang out there. It's an amazing contrast from what all that God has done, and yet the very things that we tend to or can tend to turn back toward. And then James ends with the kind of culmination for us in verses 17 to 3 of chapter 4, the culmination of a life of wisdom. And the first is this harvest of righteousness, and that will be contrasted against this just absolute storm of wreckage. Listen to verses 17 and 18. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. All said and done, what can we expect from these diametrically opposed lives? This one that runs toward God and the wisdom that he offers, and then this one that runs the opposite direction. So again, the first shows us what a fruitful life looks like. A life of holiness and a life of obedience and a literal harvest here of righteousness. It starts off the list with pure, which is, again, just a beautiful way to start. That we, in Christ, as those that have been adopted by faith, are spotless, perfect, pure. That's how God views us. We don't feel that way sometimes, but the reality of the gospel is that that's how God views us. Perfectly spotless, without blemish. Goes on to just a life of gentleness and satisfaction, living in accordance to what's been received. Right? This full of mercy means I've so experienced God's mercy for myself that I cannot help but display that mercy to those around me. They love as they've been loved. They're open to reason. Right? There's a story of Abraham Lincoln. He kind of pulled one of his messengers and said, hey, I need you to bring this message to the front line, to this general. Tell him, here's the command. I don't remember what the command was, doesn't matter. Right? So this messenger makes his way to the front line, finds this general and says, hey, I have a message for you from Lincoln. This is what he wants. And the general just said, Lincoln's a fool. There's no way I'm doing that. And the messenger goes, okay. Makes his way back to Lincoln and says, hey, this is the message back to you from the general on the front lines. He says you're a fool and he's not going to do what he told you. Lincoln's response was, I've never known him to be wrong before. Maybe I'm a fool. I'm glad we're not going to do that. Like that's what, there's a gentleness and a humility and a posture here of being open to reason in the Christian life that we don't have it all figured out. And we can be okay in humility to say, like Lincoln, you know what, he's never been wrong before. I trust him. But one of the beautiful things about this whole imagery here in verse 18, the harvest of righteousness, is that it impacts others for their good. Right? That's the point of bounty. There's plenty for all. Right? So you can think of your life much like a Thanksgiving table. Like there's so much food you cannot help. You cannot eat it yourself. You have to invite somebody else. And that's the very picture that James is painting for us of our lives, fully lived out in the wisdom that God offers, is it will produce a bounty of righteousness for those around us. But then you contrast verses 1 to 3 of chapter 4 with this, and it's just a wreckage of selfishness. I mean, you imagine a tornado coming through a small town and just devastating everything. Right, and hundreds of miles away, you see the kind of outflow of that tornado. This is what James is saying looks like in our lives when we live contrary to what God calls us to do. It's a life of selfishness and folly and unrighteousness. There's turmoil and chaos, and it impacts others as well, but not for their good. It impacts others for their own destruction. So if you look here, there's so many of these things that kind of flow out of what we saw last week in verse 5 and 6 from chapter 3. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. And we see here, left to its own devices, what the outcome of that is. Just utter disintegration. Right? He says, you know, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions, is the very same word that he uses there at the end of verse 3, which is the Greek word from which we get hedonism. So the idea here is it's about my satisfaction and my pleasure at all cost. So do whatever it takes to be joyful in stuff. Surround yourself with whatever you need to be happy. It's the love for and pursuit of pleasure above everything else. And usually that means at the expense of God himself. So God goes from being the centerpiece of your life to kind of something that we move to the side, because this has become the most important thing for me. And James is saying it's our passions that are at war within us. And basically that boils down to the broad category of what's not yours or what you shouldn't have ever. So here he's saying that they've spent everything on their passions really without a regard to the cost. C.S. Lewis talks about passions within this context as an ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure. And that's what it is. When pleasure becomes everything for us, we will experience this, an ever-increasing craving that never goes away, And the things that we're spending our passions on are pleasures that never really satisfy. And what's profound here is the very same language of spending on their passions is the very same imagery that's used in Luke chapter 15 of the prodigal son. Goes and squanders everything on his passions. And you get to the end and find the utter bankruptcy of all of it. So James now is pointing us to, look, this is the outcome of a life lived apart from God. And it ends with decay and destruction and murder and fighting and quarreling because of these passions at war. So it ends really badly. And in a lot of ways, it's pointing us to, the beauty of a life lived and culminating in wisdom, of this harvest of righteousness being sown in peace, and saying, please choose this way. Mount Everest is 29,029 feet high. I forgot to look how much it costs. It's an expensive thing to go and to purchase the permit to actually climb Mount Everest. But if you were to do that, and maybe one of you has, two of you have, but if you were to do that, on your journey through the 5.5 mile vertical trek, you would pass about 200 dead bodies. They just leave them there, frozen in the snow, as a means of marking your way up the mountain. One of those is called Green Boot Cave, as you can see from the picture, because of the green boots. 1996, an Indian climber makes his way up, starting to lose oxygen, so he kind of ducks into this cave just to catch his breath and dies. About 10 years later, a British climber making his way here sits down next to him, same thing, trying to catch his breath, eventually dies. He saw the signs. He saw it right before him. Here's somebody's dead body on the way to where I'm called to go, what I want to do, what I want to pursue, and I see the wreckage. And I'm not going to pay attention to it. And James here says that this all ends in murder. I mean, think of the absolute opposite of this harvest of righteousness, of living your life for God's glory and the good of those around you. Here it's the destruction of those around you and the taking of the very life that God has created. It's not sure if this is literally happening in the church or if James is simply speaking figuratively. But it's the outworking of unrestrained selfishness. And this morning you may go, well, that's great. To my knowledge, I've not murdered anybody. I think I'm okay. And what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount is takes some of these key ideas and ratchets them up. He doesn't diminish it. So in Matthew 5, for instance, he says, I know that you know that the law says you shouldn't murder. But I'm going to tell you that if you look at somebody with hatred in your heart, you're just as guilty. That's a profound thing as the one who comes and fulfills the law for us, that the call for us is still obedience in light of what he's done for us. So again, this idea of Satan coming, John 10 says the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And James is saying a life lived along this path of not heavenly wisdom, but earthly, unspiritual, demonic wisdom will end the very same way that Satan himself lives, so to speak, in his capacities on earth. So in the end, we're left with two choices, right? And truth be told, we don't like choices. I'm sorry, we don't like two choices. I remember years ago, about 20 years ago, I was on a mission trip to the Czech Republic, and we stopped into this small grocery store just to pick up some things. And I was struck by their shelves. They have two kinds of bread, right? Two kinds of cereal, maybe two kinds of soup, one kind of shampoo. Any idea how many variations of Cheerios there are? 10? 15? 20? They're not all still in production, but all said and done, 26. The new thing at these fast food restaurants. I mean, it used to be they're Coke and Diet Coke, and then you get 8 variations, and then it goes out from there. But the new thing is these Coke machines with the digital screen on it. Any idea how many options you get on some of those? Fully stocked, fully loaded. Any idea? 50? 100? 200? 229. See, we like options. We don't like 2. And what the Bible does over and over and over for us is reduces everything to 2 categories. It's life and death. It's true and false. It's heaven or hell. It's the narrow gate or the wide gate. You're either in or you're out. And what James does after contrasting this is really puts it before us and says, now you must choose. There is no middle ground. You cannot live in both of these places simultaneously. You must choose. And so maybe this morning you feel like you're at the early part of this and you can balance and juggle between these 2 worlds. But as we see this progress from the beginning of the text to the end, there's no way you can live between these 2 worlds. You must make a choice. And that's again what James has done in contrasting these 2, that a life lived according to God's wisdom will always produce a beautiful bounty of righteousness that blesses others. But a life lived for yourself will result in a catastrophic storm of wreckage. Always. That's the promise. Always. Well, we're going to transition to communion. And so I would encourage you that if you're a believer in